In my last video, I made a comment about how I didn't believe that Alice Springs was real. The globe is completely fake. You cannot convince me that Alice Springs is a real place where real people live. And since then, I've gotten a lot of backlash from my 100% real, non-imaginary friends about how Alice Springs is a real place. To prove them wrong, I drove to Alice Springs. I hit a roadblock when I made it to the ocean and realized that I lived 10,000 miles away. While I still don't believe in it, to please my inner demon, my real friends, I'm gonna make a video on why Alice Springs exists.
So lonesome, morbid or drear, than to stand in the bar of a pub with no beer.
No, it's not real. I'm not making a video on it. The only way to please the voices in my head is to talk about something related to Alice Springs. Alice Springs is in Australia. Australia has AFL. Bam! It's an AFL video.
But there's nothing so lonesome, morbid or drear, than to stand in the bar of a pub with no beer.
Australia used to be a British colony, and part of being a British colony is playing cricket. Almost all former British colonies do this, except for America, because we picked up other, better pastimes, like owning guns, something Australians can't do. Anyways, being a country that likes cricket, Australia has formed a lot of cricket teams. Cricket teams in Australia normally played during the summer months and did not play during the winter. This led to a lot of cricketers being out of shape. The way to fix this? Make them play a sport during the winter too. In many parts of the country, particularly Melbourne, Australian rules football became the sport. I'll get back to the history of the sport, but the title of this video is literally called What is the AFL? So I should probably explain the rules of the sport. This explanation, like the entire video, is a gross overgeneralization, and I'll probably make more videos going into more detail about it later. But anyways, you have 18 people on a large oval field. If you get the ball, you can kick it. If someone catches this kick at least 15 meters away from where you were when you kicked it, they take a mark. When you take a mark, no one can tackle you for 10 to 30 seconds, depending on how close you are to the goal. You can also choose the handball, or basically punch the ball away with your hand. You're not allowed to throw the ball or the other team gets the ball. If you kick the ball between the two big posts, you get 6 points. If you kick the ball between the big post and a small post, you get 1 point, and that's the basic rundown. If you want more rules in depth, go look up a different video or something. Back to the history. In 1859, the Melbourne Football Club, who happened to be last year's premiers or champions, made a set of 10 rules to govern Aussie rules football games in the area. After years of informal games, many of which consisted of schools playing against each other, in 1877, 6 teams, including 5 who participate in the modern-day AFL, came together to form the Victorian Football Association. Throughout the years, more and more teams would join in the competition. Also, unlike major American sports, the way Australian football teams got their players was not through a draft, but through zones. Essentially, you would play for the hometown team, and you can't leave that team unless they say okay. All was well and good in the VFA until in 1896, where 6 rich clubs got mad at the fact that other teams were poor, which means they were making less money. The fact that other teams were poor made them so mad that they quit the VFA and made their own league, the Victorian Football League. The VFL did some pretty big innovative things for the sport, including adding a final series, or what America calls the playoffs or postseason. Before this, the premier or champion was whoever had the best record at the end of the season, which today is called the minor premier. The VFL also started the first Australian-wide competition, the Championship of Australia. Calling it Australian-wide is incredibly deceptive and basically a lie, because only the premiers of the South Australian Football League and the VFL got to play against each other. By 1925, the VFL had completely destroyed the VFA, causing several top VFA teams to switch over to the VFL, essentially establishing the VFA as the minor league to the VFL, which is basically the way that the leagues work together even to this day. Then, everything was going well in the VFL for a while. There were some changes to the Championship of Australia, and it became the night series and whatnot, but I'll probably make a video dedicated to just that at some point. As I was saying, everything was going well, and then the 1980s happened. To make a long story short, capitalism happened, the rich clubs got richer, the poor clubs got poorer. One of these poor clubs was the South Melbourne Swans. They were so poor that in 1982, the Victorian Football League decided to send them to Sydney. For non-Australians, Sydney is not in Victoria. In 1986, to get money to give to the poor Victorian teams, the Victorian Football League sold franchises to Queensland and West Australia. These teams became the Brisbane Bears and the West Coast Eagles. The best part is that the Brisbane Bears didn't even play in Brisbane most of the time. They played in a substantially smaller city about an hour south, the Gold Coast. Anyways, these interstate expansion teams were given a ton of extra fees. This, combined with being absolutely terrible, led the Brisbane Bears to hit up one of the poor Victorian clubs, the Fitzroy Lions, and they merged into one team, the Brisbane Lions. And they actually moved to Brisbane after that. Remember what I said earlier about players being forced to play for the team closest to them? Well, in 1986 they added the draft, and with this, the VFL began its Americanization. The next year, a salary cap was introduced, and then, in 1990, the VFL renamed itself to the Australian Football League, 8 years after South Melbourne moved to Sydney. In 1990, one of my favorite stories in the AFL took place. Port Adelaide asked to be allowed to join the AFL, then the South Australian Football League got pissed off and said, no, you can't do that. Port said yes we can, and then it went through the courts, and they decided that Port was screwed and they had to stay in the SANFL. The league then made a new team called the Adelaide Crows. 4 years later, Port Adelaide got to join the league anyways, along with another team in Perth, the Fremantle Dockers. One sad thing that happened in the 90s was teams leaving their single team stadiums in favor of having multiple teams in a single larger stadium. Imagine fierce rivals like the Bears and Packers or Yankees and Red Sox playing in the same stadium. It's hard to imagine one team not having the home field advantage. Not a whole lot happened up until 2011. The Gold Coast Suns joined the competition, returning Australian rules football to the Gold Coast for the first time since the Brisbane Bears actually moved to the city they were named after. Then a year later, in 2012, the Greater Western Sydney Giants, who have a theme song that goes unnecessarily hard, joined the AFL.
Well, there's a big, big sound from the west of the town. It's the sound of the mighty Giants.